My name is Sharon Erickson. I'm a Master Gardener volunteer here in Santa Clara County, and I'll be your moderator for tonight's session. On behalf of the UC Master Gardeners of Santa Clara County, I want to welcome you to Growing Tomatoes and Peppers Successfully. The University of California Master Gardener program extends research-based information about home horticulture and pest management to the public. Tonight's program is being co-sponsored by the Palo Alto Library. We're grateful for their ongoing support. And with that, I'd like to introduce your presenter for this section, Joan Cloutier. Joan has been a UC Master Gardener since 2009. Joan, you can take it away.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for coming tonight on this rainy evening here. Today, we're going to talk about growing tomatoes and peppers in your garden. You know, they both have very similar requirements. And the same with eggplants. So we're going to mention eggplants tonight too. We're going to discuss planting practices, soil, fertilizer, staking, pruning, watering, and some other cultural requirements. Then we're going to talk about some varieties available. We'll also cover some disease insect pests and if you encounter these, what you might do about them. Okay, and I think Sharon just covered this, and our website is posted on the handout and all that. Okay, tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants. Okay, they're all members of the Solanaceae or the nightshade family, and tomatoes originated in the arid regions of South America near the Andes. So they originated or are native to a very dry, warm environment. Peppers are native to Mexico, Northern South America, Central America. And eggplants, they're native to India. So they were brought to China over 1,500 years ago from India and also to Southeast Asia. So they've been in all those areas for quite a long time. These are all warm season crops. They all have very similar requirements. They even get a lot of them get the same diseases. And why are tomatoes so popular? Well, this is the #1 vegetable. It's really a fruit, but people call it a vegetable, grown by home gardeners. They can produce fruit for almost 4 months. There are a lot of different dishes and cuisines that use tomatoes and peppers. You should be able to get at least maybe 10 to 15 pounds per plant, you know, depending on the variety. And sometimes even more, you know, sometimes up to 20 pounds per plant. So that's pretty good. Okay, seed or transplant. All right, you might want to, you know, you might be thinking still about planting seeds. You know, if you want to plant tomato, pepper, or eggplant seeds, you probably should do it fairly soon because we're starting to, you know, to run into that time period where you really need to start them about 6 to 8 weeks before planting in your outdoor soil. And the other thing, tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants all require warm soil to start the seeds. Tomato seeds germinate maybe in about 6 to 12 days, a little faster if you have them on a heating pad. But they really like temperatures in the 70s and maybe up to 86 degrees. That's when they germinate the best. But peppers usually take a little bit longer than tomato seeds, with the exception of chili peppers, hot peppers. They take really long to germinate. So it's probably too late to germinate your own chili peppers. They could take weeks to germinate, and they like temperatures in the 80s for germination temperatures. And then after you germinate the seeds, they need enough light so that they don't get leggy and weak. Because if they don't have enough light, the stems are going to stretch and you won't have strong plants that will withstand the outdoors. So you want a strong plant. You know, a lot of you probably don't have the time or the right conditions to germinate your own seed and grow your own plants. So you could just go to the garden center and maybe get some transplants. Look for good quality plants, not those sitting around for a few weeks or exposed to a cold rainstorm like today. If you've already purchased your plants, whether it be pepper, eggplant, or tomatoes, you know, you really shouldn't plant them in the soil, outdoor soil yet. But if you haven't planted them yet, what you might do is bring them out during the day when we have warm, sunny afternoons, bring them out during the day, and they'll kind of harden off that way too. And they like the warmth during the day, and bring them in at night, because it's our night temperatures right now that are brutal. They will not do that well at our night temperatures. When to plant, like I think I kind of mentioned, the soil should be warm. Okay, so some experts say the soil temperature should be about 55 degrees or higher. And other people will say, you know, consistent night temperatures above 55 or higher. But if you're getting 80s during the day and you have 53 every morning, that's probably okay too. But instead of doing all the math and figuring how many days did we get above this temperature, if you're in the Bay Area, usually a good planting date for peppers, tomatoes, and eggplants would be close to May 1st. That's a good, safe planting date, close to May 1st. Please try not to plant them, especially before mid-April. You know, if we have really warm weather in April and it's not May 1st yet, maybe a little earlier, you could plant them, but try to stay close to that date. Okay, you might say, well, I want to give my plants a head start, but roots of these plants will not grow in cold soil. There's a lot of possible problems. They could get some root diseases, and the foliage may get blights and foliar fungus diseases or bacterial diseases. So it's just best not to plant them too early. You will not get a head start. Now, another thing about planting tomatoes, try to choose a spot in a sunny area. You really need around 8 hours of sun, at least over 7 hours would be good. You can work the soil and add compost to the area. If there's one amendment that master gardeners would totally recommend you use over anything else, it would be compost. Compost is so beneficial to your soil. It contains all kinds of beneficial microbes. And they've only discovered this maybe in the last, 10 or 15 years. A long time ago, 30 years ago, they didn't know much about soil microbes at all. So the more they learn, the more they say compost is really an excellent addition to your soil. You could use some compost manure, that's okay too, but don't eliminate the compost if possible. Some of the microbes in compost, I wanted to say, they will make more water and nutrients available to your plant roots. And sometimes they'll even maybe help prevent some diseases in your plant roots, but no guarantees here, but they're finding out more and more about some of these individual microbes. So I was saying compost manure, that's okay to add when you're digging the hole and when you're gonna plant your tomatoes. You can add some of that too, but go kind of at a low rate. You don't wanna add a lot. Always look at the package. Never use above the package rates, the directions on the package. So composted manure, it doesn't contain too much nitrogen. That's why it's not considered a fertilizer. It's considered an amendment, but just use a low rate. Now, nitrogen fertilizer, you can use it at this time. You can mix some in the soil, but only go at a very low rate. The reason for that is that tomatoes, they don't use that much fertilizer in the first few weeks after you plant them out in the yard. So you only need a low rate. If you add too much nitrogen fertilizer, this is what could happen. The plant's going to absorb so much nitrogen, you're going to get all this foliar growth, all this leafy growth, and the plant might not produce flowers, which produce fruit. So you don't want too much fertilizer. The other thing that can happen, if there's high rates of nitrogen in your plant leaves, in your foliage, it attracts bad insect pests, such as aphids. They somehow detect high nitrogen and they love it. They'll be attracted to your plant and start feeding on your plants. So you don't want too much fertilizer. You can treat peppers and eggplants the same. So if you use some fertilizer to begin with, just a very low rate at this time. Okay, plant your tomatoes deep. You can see on the, you can see on this slide here, the planting depth, secondary root ball. This is the original root ball right here, when you plant the plant deep. And then tomatoes have the adventitious roots. They sprout on the stem of the plant if you plant it deep. So you're going to have more roots to absorb more nutrients and water and all that. So that's good. That's a good thing. So you can see the person planting the tomato here very deep. And after it's planted, the only thing showing are the leaves. That long stem is all underground. So that's good. Okay, this is another diagram of planting deep. You can almost plant the tomato sideways or horizontal. So that's a good example. One thing I want to mention though, you might say, well, what about peppers? Peppers, they normally do not recommend planting this deep because they do not have adventitious roots. There's a chance you might get stem rot if you plant it this deep. So with peppers, and I would say eggplants, I would plant them kind of even with the root ball. If they're a teeny bit deeper than the root ball, that's okay, but don't plant them deep like this, just to take precautions about that. All right, spacing your tomatoes. This is really important. You want to allow enough space between your plants. You want to look at your plant seed, either the seed package, if you germinated your seeds, or the seed catalog, or the plant tag, and see what they say about the spacing of the plant, how big it's going to get, because tomatoes are all over the board. So are peppers and eggplants for that matter. You might have a plant that gets, like a tomato plant that gets 6 feet tall, and some only get 18 inches tall. So there's a huge difference. You don't want to crowd your plants because there's more potential for diseases, if you crowd your plants. It's just not good. And also your quality of fruit won't be as good because you're not going to get enough light into that foliage if you crowd the plants together. The other thing, crowded plants make it a lot more difficult to harvest the fruit and control the weeds. You might have some weeds growing under that you don't know about if you crowd your plants. So you want to keep the weeds at bay too. I want to say just a couple of words about high density planting tomatoes because you may have heard about this. It doesn't mean crowding the plants. It's planting basically two plants in one hole, and you treat it like one plant. But row and spacing guidelines should be followed because, again, like we previously said, you don't want to crowd your plants. So you could use two indeterminates. If they're big indeterminates, that might not be the best idea, but and we'll talk about indeterminates and all that. Indeterminate plants can get huge. But anyway, cherry tomatoes are a good one to try with this. I like to try new cherry tomatoes every year. And sometimes when I just don't want to, plant more plants, I'll do 2 in 1 hole of 2 different cherry tomatoes. And that actually works really well. But you will have to probably prune the plants. You want to think of it as one plant. So you want to do some pruning there. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Because you're going to need you're not going to want so much foliage there that it's a thicket or anything like that. So treat it like one plant, but do some pruning on both of the plants so that you have some light and some air circulation in there. And you might be successful. If you want to try some new varieties, this is a good way. Okay, we highly recommend mulching between plants. And it's nice to use an organic material. There's things you can use like, straw, sawdust, wood chips, bark, chopped leaves, even tree trimmings. They usually have a lot of leaves in them. They're good because they'll decompose into compost. And remember what we said about compost. We highly recommend that. Now you can use or they have different colored plastics too, but you can use plastic, and black plastic will absorb more heat, like this picture on the bottom here. It'll absorb more heat and warm up the soil better in spring or early summer. But there is a lot of plastic waste now, and I don't know about contributing more to the plastic waste problem. But if you have like some empty soil mix bags, maybe sometimes they are black anyway. It doesn't have to be black either, but maybe you could reuse some existing plastic or something like that. So you're not, putting some new plastic down that you're going to throw out later. All right, staking tomatoes. you'll do yourself a big service if you stake the plants early, because when they start growing fast, there's vines all over the place. And if you have to put cages over them, you might break a bunch of vines, and there's leaves, and it's just a mess. Even if you're using a stake or stakes with rope in between, you know, try to start it as early as possible, the process, because, you know, once they're long vines, they're really hard to get up over the ground. There's a lot of ideas on staking, and our Master Gardener Santa Clara Valley website has a whole section on staking. They have a lot of really good ideas if you don't want to spend a lot of money on tomato cages and stuff like that. There's lots of good ideas on our website, on our local website, about staking tomatoes and peppers and eggplants you can stake too. Now, here I have some pictures of peppers. So peppers you might not need as sturdy stakes as tomatoes, but it's still a good idea to stake them, because once they get big fruit, sometimes they tend to fall over, and then the fruit touches the ground and might start rotting. So here you can see there's more of a flimsy stake, but that's probably good enough for this type of pepper. Wooden stakes here. Here they use some like tree limbs that they're recycling, I guess, and they have string or rope in between to keep the peppers upright. Here they just use wooden stakes again. So again, there's lots of different things you can use as staking material. It doesn't have to be a tomato cage. Okay, pruning tomatoes. This is really helpful, especially when growing indeterminate varieties that grow so huge. Okay, when you're pruning tomatoes, the reason you might want to prune, if you have a lot of growth there and they're just getting too thick, if you do some pruning, you're going to help with air circulation and let a little more light into the plant. This will improve your fruit quality. The other thing, if the plant becomes too thick, like a thicket of foliage, you're going to start getting some pest problems, especially things like aphids or even snails or slugs. So pruning helps. Now, what to prune? You'll see this guy is pointing to a little sucker. We call that a sucker. And it's kind of between the leaf of the plant and the main stem. And you can just prune those, snap them out. If they get bigger and you're taking them out, you can use a pruning shears too. Here's another one below that. But you don't have to take every single one out, but just, you know, prune here and there. And if you have a long vine that's crossing over one of your paths or something, don't be afraid to cut it out. Tomatoes can tolerate pruning. Just don't prune it so much that all the fruit's going to be exposed to the sun all day long, because that wouldn't be good either. But pruning can really help. And you can prune determinate or indeterminate varieties. Watering. Try to water near the root system. The problem if you, like here, and I know when you're hand watering, you're going to get some foliage wet, but just try not to water all the foliage if possible. If possible, if you can point your stream of water toward the roots as much as possible, that will really help. Because again, you can get foliar diseases and aphids and things if you keep the foliage too wet. You can cut back on watering as the plant begins to fruit, you know, when you're in the garden soil, not if you're in a container though. And you can reduce watering even more in September. Some people just cut it off completely sometime in September, but don't do this if you're growing tomatoes in a container, because in a container, you definitely need to keep watering. Okay, a few more words on fertilizer. We're going to talk about this again because we'll probably suggest that you make another application of fertilizer. You might have put some in the hole or you put some in the soil at the very beginning, hopefully a very low rate. A few things I want to say. Nitrogen is the element that these plants use the most of. So it would be nice if you had more nitrogen in your fertilizer than anything else, because that's what they're going to use the most of. And you know, most of the plants in your yard, it's going to be nitrogen they're going to use the most of. And especially things, yeah, tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, And I think almost all your other crops, it's going to be nitrogen. So on all fertilizer packages, there are 3 numbers. N stands for nitrogen. P is phosphate, or that contains the phosphorus. Phosphorus is essential to your plants too. And K is potassium or potash. Okay, so the first number is nitrogen. So it would really be nice if you're going out to buy a fertilizer that you have more nitrogen than the other 2 numbers on the package, because that's what you're going to use the most of. See, in our Santa Clara Valley clay soils, we have plenty of phosphorus and potassium in our soil. So you don't really need to add more of that. You know, if your fertilizer has some in, it's okay, but I wouldn't get a fertilizer that has huge amounts of those 2 and low nitrogen. Here's blood meal, 1200. This would be a good one to use, 12% nitrogen and no phosphorus or potassium or anything else. This fertilizer here, it's a 2510. Okay, it has some phosphorus and potassium in it, but it mainly has nitrogen. So that would be a good one too. Now, if you're in, all fertilizers have to have a guaranteed analysis somewhere on the package too. You'll see the 3 numbers on the top of the bag. Then you see the guaranteed analysis. If you are growing in a container, it's different than growing in a soil. Then you do need a complete fertilizer. You need nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and trace elements like the one on the right. It shows in the guaranteed analysis, it has iron in it, copper, manganese, boron, I'm not that concerned with, but magnesium, manganese. I think I saw manganese on here somewhere. That's important too. Yeah, iron, manganese, zinc, that's real important. If you're growing in a container, because potting soils don't have a long-term amount of these elements in the potting soil. So you need a complete fertilizer if you're in a container. And by the way, there is a YouTube, I did a presentation maybe a few weeks ago on growing warm season vegetables in containers, and I talked more about some of these things. And it's on our YouTube, it's on our Master Gardener website. If you look at videos, it's posted on there so you can get it. All right, a few other things about fertilizer. There will also be on the package somewhere the rates. Okay, and we're recommending that you don't go at high rates and never go off the labeled rate on the package, like the higher than what's on the package. So there are a lot of problems you can have, burning your plant, polluting the environment. You know, you just don't need, attracting pests to your plant. You don't need, you know, so much fertilizer. So go according to packaged rates. You might ask, some of the fertilizers you're showing here, one had before you had a 20% nitrogen, this is 8, this is 10. Okay, don't worry, the rates are worked out for the analysis. So don't worry about this, just read the directions on the package. The companies work out the rates for you so you don't have to do the calculations, because obviously this fertilizer, you'd have to use more than this one because this is 10%, 8, but don't worry about any of that. Just read the package and read the directions on the package. Okay, so next slide will be, okay, this is the time when tomato plants are going to use most of the nutrients, when they're flowering and beginning to produce fruit. When you start seeing these small fruits on your tomato plant, this is the time they use the most nutrients. So it's a good time to fertilize. This is definitely a good time to make a fertilizer application. Now, when you apply fertilizer, nutrients have to be in a water-soluble state to be absorbed by the root system. So make sure you water enough after fertilizing, because there's lots of different types of fertilizer. If you put a granular fertilizer on the top, you've got to water it in to make sure those nutrients get to the root system. Or you might have used a water-soluble or liquid. Whatever you do, make sure you water it in. And let's see what else. Okay, I think I covered everything here. Okay, reapplication rates. There's lots of different fertilizers out there that last different amounts of time. So on the package, it might say reapply in 2 weeks or reapply in 4 weeks. So after you start seeing these fruit, You could probably reapply a fertilizer again, maybe 1 or 2 times. But if you've used compost in the soil, I would go again at low rates, and you may not even have to reapply more than once or so. All right, now we're going to just mention some different varieties that you might consider planting. Things to think about, because when you're planting tomatoes, you might think about days to harvest, and that will usually be on the plant tag or in the seed catalog or on your seed package. So are they early varieties or late varieties? It might be 83 days to harvest on one variety and 59 days to harvest on another. So if you're going to grow a few different tomato plants, you might want to get some that are early and some that are later. So it's just something to think about. Disease resistance. This is becoming more important as we get more diseases. And it seems like there is a lot of disease pressure, especially in our soil with some of the fungus diseases. And I'll talk about that later. Size and shape. If you have kids, you might want to consider cherry tomatoes. A lot of people say kids love cherry tomatoes, and it's the easiest tomato to get them to eat when they're very young. If you make a lot of sauce, or you might want to think about paste tomatoes. So there's a lot to choose from, and there's lots of different colors and flavors. And then compact versus large plants. A lot of the yards are getting very small, and maybe you only have a patio to grow things in a container. So you might want to consider compact plants for that application, or if you only have a small space. Now we'll talk about determinate versus indeterminate plants. First, I want to say studies really don't show that there's no difference in yield. It's more of a variety difference than it is whether the plant is determinate or indeterminate. So what happens, indeterminate tomatoes, they kind of continue growing until you have really cold weather in fall, or frost kills them or something like that. So they easily can get 6 feet or higher. So you need really sturdy cages or stakes for indeterminate varieties, because they'll keep growing and growing. Some people use even concrete reinforcing wire to make tomato cages. And don't forget, if you're growing indeterminate varieties, it's a good idea to put a label somewhere where you can see it, so you know what variety you're growing, because the label might get lost, because there's so much, they get so big. Okay, and then we have determinate tomato plants. Okay, determinate varieties stay shorter, usually 2 to 4 feet, but sometimes they'll get maybe up to 5 feet or so. Sometimes standard tomato cages work, but sometimes they get pretty big fruit. So I still like to use maybe fairly sturdy stakes for some of these varieties, especially if they get 4 or 5 feet tall and they've got maybe beefsteak type fruit or classic fruit. So the fruit can get heavy, and you really want to keep your fruit off the soil, off the ground. So you might want to, again, look at the tomato description on your tag, your plant tag or seed catalog. If it only gets 18 inches like the plant on the right, I've grown this one, Patio Choice, it's called. I use a real small, flimsy tomato cage for this. I still use a very small tomato cage just to keep the fruit upright. But if you wanted it in a hanging basket, then I guess you didn't have to do this. All right. So determinate plants, one thing about them is they'll produce most of their tomatoes within a few week time period, and they'll continue to produce fruit after that, but not a lot. So it's maybe within a 3-week time period, they're going to produce a lot of fruit, and then it kind of, it gets a lot less after that, but you'll still get some. You don't have to pull out the plant at that time. Okay, hybrids versus heirlooms. Okay, a hybrid is really a result of a cross of 2 different plants, and you're trying to get the best characteristics from each parent plant. So hybrids are produced under really strict condition, usually mesh cages or greenhouses, somewhere protected so they don't have outside influences like insects or wind, so that won't affect the outcome. They're very, very consistent. But don't save seeds of a hybrid because you have no idea what you're going to get, because again, they have two different parents. So you don't know what you're going to get. Okay, heirlooms are open pollinated by wind or insects, and the seeds you collect will usually contain most of the characteristics of the parent plant. However, if there are some different tomato varieties in the area, you may get more variability on heirlooms. Okay, one of the things is that where there is a pretty big difference is disease resistance. Hybrids are generally a lot more disease resistant than most heirlooms. When hybrids are developed, when hybrid tomatoes are developed, the plant breeders feel that disease resistance is really, really important. So they almost always put some disease resistance, into the, or they watch for this when they're selecting the plants that will make the final cut. They want disease resistance. Okay, so a lot of heirlooms are not very disease resistant. So if you've had some disease problems in the past and you're planting, a bunch of tomatoes, you might want to plant some hybrids just for insurance. So that would be probably a pretty good idea. Most heirlooms have longer days to harvest, but there are some that are pretty early too. And yield is often higher in hybrids. They're more modern varieties. So, if a hybrid doesn't yield very good, it's usually thrown out, or they don't select it for the final cut. Okay, flavor, shelf life, it depends. Sometimes heirlooms have a shorter shelf life because their skin might be thinner on the fruit, which might be a more desirable characteristic when you're eating it. Flavor is often better in heirlooms. They can be really sweet and flavorful. But some of the new hybrids developed are getting a lot better. And if you let your tomatoes ripen properly, anything you grow is going to be 1,000 times better than a store-bought tomato. So just let your tomatoes ripen properly. Okay, some of the types of tomatoes, don't get too hung up with the types of tomatoes because there's everything in between. There's classics and beefsteaks and all these things. And sometimes in one seed catalog, they'll consider a certain variety a classic, and another they'll call it a beefsteak or a slicer. So it's kind of all over the board when it comes to classic beefsteaks. And I didn't even put slicer up here. But paste is usually has some characteristics. Paste tomatoes down here, they usually are less juicy, and they're really good to make tomato paste or tomato sauce because it doesn't get as runny as you would from some of the other tomatoes. So they're really good to cook with. Cherry tomatoes usually are just very small, very sweet. Usually they ripen pretty early too, a lot of them. I might want to mention too, if you have conditions that are questionable for growing tomatoes and you really, really want to grow tomatoes, try some cherry tomatoes because they usually turn out pretty good, even if conditions aren't so perfect. There's grape tomatoes. There are a lot of orange grape tomatoes that are really good. And you just have a lot to select from. Okay, here are some what they consider classic tomatoes in some seed catalogs. And I've seen Whopper classified as a beefsteak, but they're usually kind of rounded. They don't have a lot of creases in them. That Whopper, by the way, that's a really good flavorful tomato. All these, by the way, Better Boy, Celebrity, Early Girl, and Whopper have pretty good disease resistance. So I just want to say that if you're going to the garden center to buy your transplants, these are some things to think about. Okay, classics. Here are just some more pictures of classics. You can get green and, orange and even yellow, almost whitish tomatoes. This one here, Mountain Magic and Mountain Magic, I've seen this classified as a something else. I don't know, a slicer, I think. And here's Celebrity. That's a pretty popular tomato. That has good disease resistance, by the way. So does Mountain Magic. Then you have beefsteaks. But again, sometimes beefsteaks are also considered classics, whatever. I might want to mention Big Beef. That's a pretty popular variety. It was at one time an AAS All-American Selection winner. If you see that AAS symbol, that means it was tested in a whole bunch of different locations and it had good flavor, good disease resistance, good yield. And they have a website, All American Selections. And every year they pick some for being the new selections that are really good. Okay, these two have really, the Mountain Merit and Big Beef have pretty good disease resistance too. I think Beef Master does too. But anyway, if you plant several tomatoes, diversity is probably good. You know, plant a few of different varieties. Okay, here's some paste tomatoes and San Marzano. I don't have a picture, but that's probably the most famous paste tomato around, San Marzano. One of the things about paste tomatoes, a lot of them tend to get blossom end rot. And we'll talk about that later. Not all of them, but some of them do. And cherry tomatoes. These are probably the easiest to grow out of any tomatoes. So again, I mentioned before, if you have questionable conditions for tomatoes and you really are set on growing some tomatoes, you know, try cherry tomato. If you don't have enough light, if you don't have your 7 or 8 hours of sunlight every day, you know, try a cherry tomato. I've seen some master gardeners cherry tomatoes at their homes where they were, you know, blocked by a tree part of the day or whatever, and they were still able to get a pretty decent yield of fruit off their cherry tomatoes. So cherry tomatoes are a little more resilient on everything. And then you have grape tomatoes. I want to mention this variety, Juliet. It yields huge quantities of grape tomatoes. I just can't believe that was an AAS winner a few years ago. But I've grown this, I grow this almost every year now because I cut them open and dehydrate them. They're really sweet. So huge yield, and it just keeps producing till I get frost in my area in Morgan Hill here. Okay. Then you have a lot of new varieties of patio and container varieties. Even though where I live in Morgan Hill, I have an acre of land, I still grow some tomatoes in containers. This one and this one is mine. So I grow some cherry tomatoes in containers, and some of the bush varieties. This is Bush Early Girl. Yields pretty good, disease resistant, tastes good if you let it ripen. This is just a picture of another variety. But because they realize that yards are getting smaller and a lot of people only have patios now to grow things, so there's lots of new varieties of patio and container varieties of tomatoes. And also there are more compact varieties of peppers and eggplants too. So even if you just have a patio, you probably can still have a garden, which is nice. Here's some more varieties of patio and container varieties. I want to mention this one. Oh, Lozano, you may see this in some of the seed catalogs or at the store. This is a real sweet, really good tasting variety. But the smallest tomato that I've ever grown in my life, that I've ever seen, is this super compact variety called Red Robin. And some of the garden centers sell it. And it gets ripe really early, like it's only, I don't know, 48 or 52 days to harvest. And it only grows 8 inches tall. It's super compact. It gets a pretty big yield for the size of the plant. But I'm not so sure the tomatoes taste that good. But on the other hand, what else gets ripe that early? There's no other tomatoes anywhere around that get ripe so early. So I was thinking of just growing it like for the earliness and then growing something else in its place for later, because when the good tomatoes start getting ripe. So it's a pretty interesting variety, but I'm not sure about the flavor. I still think it maybe tastes better than grocery store varieties or grocery store tomatoes though. Then there's, there's the Indigo series of tomatoes. These were developed University or Oregon State University, I think. Anyway, they're high in anthocyanins and antioxidants, so they're supposed to be very healthy for you. And there's all kinds of different indigo tomatoes now, indigo blue and indigo gold and cream and rose. But you have to pick this when the fruit softens. And they usually take about 75 or 80 days to ripen properly. And I'll tell you, you will be in for a very bitter experience if you pick these tomatoes when they're hard and purple. Oh my gosh. I know some people who grew them for the first time, they just couldn't stand them and said, these are horrible tomatoes, but they didn't let them ripen properly. I've grown some of these, and this indigo cream, it gets really, really sweet once you let it get really ripe. So they will taste good if you let them ripen properly, but don't eat them purple and they change color a little bit. They all start out purple, but some of them get a little more red or gold or cream or whatever. And then there's something called grafted tomatoes. Like we were mentioning, a lot of the heirloom tomatoes are more susceptible to diseases. Not all of them, but most of them. So anyway, what some companies are doing now, they're grafting heirloom tomatoes onto a real fungus-resistant rootstock, because a lot of our fungus diseases are Verticillium and Fusarium wilt. So they are grafting onto a rootstock that's resistant to this. So you can do this. They use these little grafting plastic clips here. I've tried this. I've done it a few times. I've been successful, but wow, you need hands like a surgeon. It's not easy to get that little stem, you know, in that clip and to connect the two. It's not that easy, so I'm just warning you. And the rootstock seeds, you know, I grew the seeds for the rootstock, and then I grew the heirloom tomatoes for the top. And the rootstock seed, it's kind of expensive too. And I think it might be cheaper just to go buy a grafted variety than do it yourself, especially because some of them didn't take because my hands are not like surgeon hands. So anyway, but this is kind of fun. You may see these in some of the garden centers. They were real popular a few years ago, I know, and they still sell some of these. Okay, now we'll talk a little bit about some of the pepper varieties. There's bell peppers, and those are sweet peppers. There's long sweet peppers. This Thunderbolt hybrid, that's a sweet long pepper. Cornito giallo, that's a sweet pepper. And then you've got the hot chili peppers, like serranos, cayenne, jalapenos, habaneros, all kinds of them. All right, lots of different sweet peppers available now. You can get them in so many different colors, but peppers always start out green. Okay, when you grow them and they first start getting fruit, they're going to be green. They don't change colors and get real sweet and develop full flavor until it gets hotter outside, till the weather really gets warm. So that's usually a little bit later in the season. So don't be disappointed if you see green peppers or long green peppers, because they're all going to start out green. You can get peppers in almost every color now, I think. Now, hot peppers, they start out green too, but then they turn their appropriate color. Okay, there's something called the Scoville unit, and that measures how hot the pepper is. So the bigger the number, the hotter are the peppers. And like jalapenos, I think jalapenos are only 2,500 to 5,000 Scoville units. It's not that high compared to a lot of the other peppers. Anaheims and poblanos are not that high either. So you can get on the web all over the place. You'll see these charts with the Scoville unit, and it shows and that's the heat unit chart. You'll see Anaheim peppers are not very hot. Poblanos, not too bad. Jalapenos, and it depends which variety you get. That's why you see this range, 2,500 to 8,000 Scoville units for jalapenos. But some jalapenos are milder than others. It depends which variety you get. And then serranos, then cayenne. These start getting pretty hot. And Thai, and let's see, habaneros. I ate those, I think, once, and oh my gosh, they were so hot. They say if your mouth is so hot, you should have a glass of milk or something. They say milk is better than water for reducing the hotness in your mouth. So, anyway, and these charts are all over the web. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about pests, diseases, physiological disorders. Again, peppers, tomatoes, and eggplants, they're all fairly similar. A lot of them get the same diseases. Okay, here's some disease-resistant symbols on tomatoes and peppers. So when you buy a plant and it has a plant tag, it might have letters like V or F or TMV on it, and that means they're somewhat resistant to some of these diseases. I don't have all the symbols on this slide. There's a lot more than here, but these are some of the real popular ones that we might get in our area. So again, there's a lot more than this. A few things I want to say about resistance, disease resistance. Okay, just because it says it's Verticillium resistance, that's not a 100% guarantee that you won't get it or that your plant won't get it, but it's more unlikely. It's kind of like a vaccine, you know, like a flu vaccine. You might still get the flu, but it's more unlikely that you'll get the flu and maybe you won't get it as bad. So anyway, thought I'd mention this because if you look on your plant tag or a seed catalog, you'll see, you might see these symbols. If you don't see the symbols, there's a chance they have no resistance at all. So you might want to look for those. Right? The fungal diseases that are really popular here are these two, Verticillium and Fusarium. Okay, first Fusarium wilt. This is a root fungus disease. It infects roots and it spreads throughout the plant. It really affects the water conducting tissue of the plant, the xylem. So it might start out yellowing of shoots or leaves or half the plant, but then that yellowing will turn to brown, it'll die. So those are some of the first signs. It can spread on infected seed. It can stay in the soil for many, many years. So if you've had this if you have it in your soil, the best solution is to either get resistant varieties or plant in a container. You know, start a container garden. I think Verticillium wilt might even be more popular in our area than Fusarium wilt. I know in South County, the former extension agent used to always talk about Verticillium wilt. So it's very widespread in California soils, and I know in our county, it's very widespread. So the first sign of this is sometimes yellow blotches, maybe yellow blotches on older leaves, and then symptoms develop in more areas, and they turn brown, wilt, and die. So this, again, you can lose your whole plant with this. Or sometimes, with Verticillium wilt, what is really interesting though, it's favored by cool spring weather, but the symptoms might not show up until the fruit starts forming. So for all that time you've been growing this plant and it might have Verticillium wilt, and you don't know it had a disease until it starts fruiting, and then you start seeing these symptoms. So it's another reason why not to plant too early, because you're more likely to get this if you plant early. It can persist indefinitely in a soil. There are resistant varieties available. So you might want to look at tomatoes that have a V. Now there's different races of Verticillium wilt. You might see a V2 or V4 or something like that. But if you see that V, that's a good sign at least. Some resistant varieties you might find in the garden center would be Better Boy, Big Beef, Better Bush, Early Girl, Carmelo, Beefy Boy, Beef Master, Jet Star. You know, those are some that are somewhat resistant to this disease. And this disease affects the water conducting part of the plant, kind of similar to Fusarium wilt. So, here's another picture of Verticillium wilt. This is sometimes how it starts. It almost forms a V where the yellowing starts. It's kind of like a V shape there. This shows a pepper field that was affected by Verticillium wilt. And this shows what it does to the water conducting tissue. You'll just find a corky brown spot here. And the plant can't uptake water or nutrients anymore, and that's when it starts wilting and dies. Sometimes you'll just get stunting. There might be a little bit of water conducting tissue left that you're getting some water and nutrients to the upper plant, but it may be severely stunted and you won't get much fruit. These two diseases are sometimes hard to tell apart. So even some of the UC extension agents tell their growers, you might want to send them into a lab. You know, these growers who have like a 50-acre field, they're going to lose a lot, you know, if they start getting a disease. So anyway, they both, you know, have some yellowing parts and they turn brown and wilt. So they're not always easy to tell apart. But Verticillium and Fusarium are two of our most common diseases that are in the soil in our part of California. All right, then the viruses. This is tobacco mosaic virus, and this is another kind of common one, but now there are a lot of resistant varieties available. So look at it. Sometimes they'll just put a T on the label or in the seed catalog, or a TMV, meaning it's tobacco mosaic virus resistant. The source could be somebody who's a smoker of tobacco who walked in the field. It's really, it can be spread by tobacco or tobacco users. The seed could be contaminated. It can be carried on hands, clothes. It can be spread by insects, aphids, leafhoppers, contaminated plant material. If you see any mottling or yellowing, distorted, puckery leaves on your plant, it's best to just get rid of the whole plant and put it in the green waste, because this disease will persist a long time. It's not a soil-borne virus or anything like that, but it just will persist in the area for a really long time. It's hard to get rid of. These viruses are bad. Here's another virus, tomato yellow leaf curl virus. I just want to get you familiar with viruses. Like a lot of times the new growth will be puckery or curled inward, or sometimes it'll be stringy looking. It doesn't look normal. It looks like something's wrong with the plant. A lot of times viruses will stunt a plant also. So just be kind of familiar. It's real hard to identify exactly which virus it is in a lot of cases, but getting rid of the plant would be good, because what happens is insects can transmit this virus to your other plants, then your other tomato plants or peppers, whatever. All right, so this one is tomato leaf curl virus. This is becoming more popular in California. Stunting and distorted leaves are often symptoms. Now, there are some new varieties that are resistant to this. This one is easier to detect once you have fruit. It's called tomato spotted wilt virus. This is a bad disease, and it flares up in Santa Clara County every few years. I might mention that we have a Master Gardener demo garden down in Gilroy, and we've lost, a few years ago, we lost over a third of all the tomatoes to this disease. And it starts out like this. Kind of the leaves turn inward a little bit, and they're purplish looking. And the plant almost looks a little bit stunted in the beginning when it starts forming fruit. But then once it does form fruit, the fruit is very much spotted and looks really strange. And here's some more pictures of the spots on the fruit. Here's what some fruit might look like. You know, it's a bad disease and it comes in cycles. They've had problems with pepper fields in South County with this disease also. There are resistant varieties now available from seed companies, and we're going to do some trials at Master Garden. I've been growing some resistant varieties for a few years, and now we're going to trial them in some different parts of the county, because maybe Master Gardeners might offer some spotted wilt resistant tomatoes maybe next year at their plant sale. So the other thing that's important with this disease, control weeds. Weeds can be hosts for the virus. An example would be bindweed. Bindweed can grow perfectly well with spotted wilt virus in it and keep growing and growing. So what happens, thrips, this little insect called thrips spreads this disease. So it feeds on the bindweed, then it comes and feeds on your tomato leaves and spreads it. Then it goes back to the bindweed, and then another generation of thrips feeds on that bindweed that's infested, with tomato spotted wilt virus. There are a lot of plants that can carry this virus and be a virus reservoir, actually. So it's good to control weeds around the area too. Okay, there's this virus is spread by thrips. Thrips can be really, really small. You really need probably a magnifying glass to see them. Very, very small. Okay, this shows what it looks like on peppers. So if you ever see this on tomatoes or peppers, again, you see these weird spots. And sometimes the leaves look infected too. This is a bad infestation. On leaves, here's another different type of pepper. So I just wanted to bring this to your attention if you ever see this disease. It's best to pull out the plant and get rid of it if you have this, because again, otherwise the insects are going to keep spreading it, especially the thrips. Okay, if you get a hot spell, I know Palo Alto, it doesn't get as hot as down as South County, but if you get a hot spell, watch for this, because russet mite damage, russet mites come out and they flare up during hot spells in summer. If you have a week of really hot weather, you might notice your foliage on your tomatoes is starting to turn brownish on the bottom of the plant, or bronze color. And these are really tiny little mites that you need a real good magnifier to see. But they're not insects, they're spider mites, and they work their way up the plant. Now, the good news is that there are a lot of beneficial insects around that eat these mites. So sometimes the problem might take care of itself. But if it's really bad, and if you think you're going to lose the plant, spraying wettable sulfur might be a solution. But I will warn you that wettable sulfur will kill your beneficial insects if you've had beneficial insects there. There are some spider mites that are beneficial, that are considered beneficial insects, and they eat the bad mites, the pesty mites. So you don't want to kill them. Sometimes, you don't want to spray wettable sulfur if it's 90 degrees or higher, or you're going to burn your plant. So just kind of watch for that too. But again, sometimes this might take care of itself. Then you have tomato hornworm. These, you might see them once in a while, but they're usually not a huge problem in our area. But if you start seeing your plant being defoliated, like really fast, you might have tomato hornworms. Listen for clicks, because you can hear them when you're in your garden. They go click, click, click. So just listen for that. And usually you can spot them if you look really good, because they're huge. And then you can pick them off and squish them or do what you want with them. One of the things I want to mention, there are a lot of parasites for this hornworm. And this has been, this worm on the bottom, it's been parasitized by a braconid wasp. Now, this isn't the wasp like the yellow jackets. It doesn't bite you or any of that. It's a beneficial wasp, a very tiny wasp, but it lays eggs inside this hornworm. The eggs hatch, they come out and pupate on the hornworm. So this caterpillar is probably already dead. This might be dead already. So anyway, if you see this, don't do anything, because you want these braconid wasps, because they go after some of your pests. Okay, then you have tomato pinworm. This usually isn't going to be a huge problem either. It will turn into a moth, lay its eggs. You'll see a little hole on the top of the tomato like this, and there might be a little bit of the tomato that's affected. You could cut this off and still eat the tomato. Usually, if you have a big garden, you might see a few of these, but normally you're not going to see them all over, because there are a lot of beneficial parasites and predators that will get this pest, if you have some of these beneficial insects in your garden. Stink bug damage. This is the stink bug. It stinks when you squish it, but we highly recommend, if you find them on your tomatoes, squish them, because they do this. You're going to see white spots where they feed, and they're kind of corky or dry inside. Now you could cut all this skin off and the tomato inside will be okay, but it's kind of annoying, when you have to cut all that skin off. So this is what it looks like, and it's all kind of dryish and whitish inside that skin. So this is the culprit. There are some beneficial insects that might control this, but sometimes hand picking and controlling weeds is important too, because they like to hide in weeds in the surrounding areas and overwinter in weeds too. All right, and aphids. I think all our crops will get some type of aphid. And aphids, they can transmit several viruses, but we'll probably get them. We get them on most plants. Peppers, of course, too, get aphids. Sometimes the problem might take care of itself, but if you have a cloudy period in the middle of summer or kind of a moist, cloudy period, you might start getting more aphids. Aphids are not strong insects. Sometimes you can just wash them off the leaves, and then what happens, they fall to the ground, and the beetles get them, the ground beetles, they eat aphids. So aphids, they don't run real fast or anything. They're not going to run right back up into your plant. So a lot of times you wash them off and that's it. They're not going to come back because other things get them. Lots of beneficial insects eat aphids. They call it the bread and butter of the garden. Everyone likes aphids, even birds eat aphids. Now, if you have a really severe infestation, you could use insecticidal soap. The only problem is insecticidal soap, or like safer soap, that also will kill your beneficial insects. So if it's not real bad, you might want to just let it be and see if it takes care of itself. Now, I'm not giving a presentation on this tonight, but I love this topic about types of flowers that attract beneficial insects. It doesn't hurt to have a few flowers around your garden because beneficial insects, they love the pollen of flowers because when they don't have enough pests to eat, they feed on pollen and sometimes nectar. So these are anything closely related to daisies or asters are real good flowers to have in your garden. Yarrows, alyssum, cosmos, lots of the herbs are really good when they flower. Cilantro and dill and those things. So this is kind of a fun topic, but sunflowers, anything related to daisies or that might look like a daisy would be a good flower. Zinnias are pretty good. Okay, so back to tomatoes here. Fruit rot. Try not to let so many tomatoes touch moist soil because they might end up looking like this. They get rotten really quick if they touch moist soil. And also when watering, try not to get everything wet because this is what you might get. So, and you might do some pruning in the foliage, like I said before, if it's too thick in there and it gets wet. All right. Now, blossom enrot is kind of an interesting physiological problem. Some tomatoes seem to get it worse than others. It can be a calcium uptake disorder. Sometimes you might see more of this during cloudy, humid weather toward the beginning of the season. And it also occurs if soil moisture fluctuates a lot. So the best you can do is try to maintain a really even watering schedule, keep the soil evenly moist, not soggy, but just moist all the time. That might help a little bit. The other thing, if you've always had this problem, you might want to add a little bit of gypsum to your soil, especially when you're planting. Again, use the rates on the package. Don't go too high. Gypsum is calcium sulfate. And, maybe if, you might need more calcium in those tomatoes if they uptake it. So some varieties are more susceptible, especially your paste tomatoes. But now scientists think the latest is that genetics may also play a part. So there's some new research being done at the moment. They're trying to identify, see if there's a gene or DNA strand or whatever that might be related to blossom end rot. So they might know a lot more how to cure this or what to do about it in the future. Or maybe there will be more tomatoes that won't get it. Peppers can also get blossom end rot. Just try your best to maintain an even watering schedule and calcium. I don't know, most of our soils aren't deficient in calcium, but some people will add a little bit of gypsum. So that's about all I can say on that. Okay, another physiological problem would be sun scald. If your tomatoes or peppers or eggplants are facing the sun all day long, and especially when we get a hot spell, they could get sun scald. Tomatoes can almost boil inside during a hot spell. If it's 100 degrees out and they're facing the sun all day long, they're going to really look different after that hot spell. It's like they were boiling. They're going to get real mushy inside eventually. If you know there's a hot spell coming on the weather, they usually publicize that a lot. You might want to hang some cloth on one side of your plant. Sometimes what I do on the tomato cage, I hang some row cover or a cloth that will shade those tomatoes that are exposed. Or peppers, you can do the same thing on peppers. Okay, cap facing. This can be caused by periods of cool or hot weather during the flowering period. Some varieties are more susceptible than others. Beefsteaks and some of the heirlooms are probably the most susceptible to this. So if you see this, it might not be your fault. It might just be why, you know, that we had cool or hot weather when the plant was flowering. Okay, picking and storing. What you want to do is pick when tomatoes begin to soften. Kind of feel them, pick them. Some tomatoes you can use a pruning shear. Some just come right off the vine if you turn them a certain way. You turn them sideways or whatever, and they just kind of click and come right off the vine. So there's two different types of tomatoes out there as far as picking them. You know, so some of you are better with a pruning shear. Don't store tomatoes in the refrigerator. The cold destroys the flavor. You know, grocery stores, the tomatoes in grocery stores, they do everything possible to destroy the flavor. First, they're picked green in the field. Of course, when you see those big truckloads of tomatoes, if they were all ripe, it would be tomato sauce by the time it got to the cold storage facility. So they pick the tomatoes green, and then they put them in cold storage where they put ethylene to ripen them, get them red, right? But then it's really cold in those cold storage facilities, really cold. Then they go to the grocery store and they're put in the cold storage part of the grocery store or the refrigerator, and then they're put on the shelf and they just taste like nothing. There's no flavor, you know, so cold destroys the flavor. So even those vine ripened tomatoes that you see in the grocery store, I've tasted them and they still have no flavor. Now, at the end of the season, you can pick your green tomatoes. They may ripen. If they have any pink at all toward the blossom end of that fruit, they will definitely ripen and turn red. The problem is they're not, when they turn red, they're not going to taste like those softened tomatoes that you picked. But, you know, it's the end of the season. You're not going to get any more anyway. You know, so you can still use them. You can use them green too. There's lots of recipes for green tomatoes. So anyway, all right. And end of life, you know, sometime in mid-October, your tomatoes are going to look like this, mid or late October, depending where you live. Tomatoes decline in cold, moist nights. We start getting, you know, 40-some degree nighttime temperatures and it's moist out. You know, it's the end. You know, they're just not going to do well. And what happens with peppers and eggplants, same thing. They just may not ripen much anymore. Your peppers might just stay green, and you can pick them all and eat them green. You can do that. You might as well just all pick them. And it's really time to plant your cool season vegetables because they're going to taste really good. So it's the end of life here. But you can enjoy your tomato harvest all winter long. There's so many things you can do with tomatoes. You know, dehydrating them, you can freeze them, you can, you know, freeze tomato sauce, you can can tomato sauce, use it for soups. You know, there's just a lot you can do. Same with peppers. I know some people who make really good pepper jelly, and you can pickle the peppers, you know, you can freeze them, and there's all kinds of other things you can do with peppers. I like to freeze them like the picture on the bottom and the baggies. And then I bring them out in winter and we put them on pizzas. We use them in chili. We put them in other soups and all kinds of things. So they're fine. They're not like picking them off the vine, but they're still really, really good. So anyway, I think I'm kind of winding up here, and I really, really hope you people have a really good harvest and a good tomato crop. And, you know, we wish you the best success. And if you have questions, you can always email our helpline. So we just want to wish you the best, a successful crop, right? Okay. And I guess
well, thank you so much, Joan. So we have, of course, a number of questions. So I'm going to kind of start at the beginning. We've got some time here and we'll see how many of these we can get through, if that's okay. So Kim was asking early on mycorrhizae fungi. Do they really improve pepper and tomato yields in your experience?
Okay, if they're naturally growing in the soil, I don't know. I don't know if there's any research on that, but I did see some presentations by some university people about buying mycorrhizae in stores. And what they're concerned about is in the garden centers, the shelf life, they are live things. They're live, right? And they're not sure they're going to be alive when you get them. You know, that the mycorrhizae fungi are going to be alive when you get them. So there, some of the presentations that I've watched from some of the universities doing research on that, they're saying, if it were me, I wouldn't spend the money. That's what they actually said. So I'll just say what they said. You know, when they're naturally growing the soil, that's why they say don't till your soil too much, because you will have some natural mycorrhizae in your soil. So you want to encourage that, and compost will encourage that. Sometimes mulching may encourage that, and not tilling the soil till it's all crumbly. You can work it a little bit, but maybe not too much. So that's all I'm going to say on that topic. Okay.
Yeah. Is B1 helpful to start seedlings?
Well, I don't know. If you feel it's helped, but I don't think there's real good research on that. The university extension people usually don't even recommend it. So I'll just say that they don't, they don't recommend. They recommend adding compost, maybe using some fertilizer a little bit, maybe in the beginning. Fertilize again when you're, nitrogen is what the plants really need. Fertilize again when they start fruiting. That's what you're going to see from the recommendations from the University of California. I'm not sure how much research on B1 was really done. So I just don't know if it's really that effective. But the University of California research doesn't at all, they never recommend it. So.
Okay. And that reminds me, so Riati wanted to confirm fertilize twice during the season.
That would probably be a pretty good idea. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then
not too much, not too much. The other thing, fertilizer, two heavy rates that I failed to say, but they could also, okay, the mycorrhizae that's natural in your soil, if you have real high rates, that could disrupt the mycorrhizae in the soil too. That's why we recommend low rates.
Okay. And then we are recommending some kind of starter fertilizer. Somebody asked, or is compost enough?
It's hard to tell how much nitrogen is in your soil. I mean, if you really wanted to go all out and get a soil test and all that, you might not need to add nitrogen fertilizer, at the beginning. But University of California will say, yeah, use a little bit at the beginning. Sometimes what you're going to spend for a soil test and all the other stuff, is it worth it or not? You might just use a really low rate at the beginning.
And somebody did ask about worm compost, vermicompost. And I think our recommendation is yes, please, more.
Yeah, that's good. Sure,
Anytime.
That's good.
Okay, what should daytime temps be to take outside an already germinated seedling to get some sun?
Okay, good question. If where you put them, if it's in the maybe mid 60s or so, even if it's in the 60s, it's probably okay because they're getting sunlight. You want them to get sunlight. It would be nice if it was in the mid or high 60s if possible. Like today, it was, I don't know, at my house, it was 50 some degrees. So today would be a bad day to take them out. But if it's really sunny outside and it's in the 60s, I would still take them out. If you put them low somewhere, it may actually get warmer, like say on a patio or something. So yeah, I would definitely take them out when it's really sunny out and try to put it in the warmest spot you can think of.
And while we're on temperatures, Agnes asked, is it too early to buy tomato and pepper seedlings in the nursery? Should we wait until mid-April for warmer nights to plant them out?
Yes, wait, don't plant them out yet, definitely. So I don't even know, after this rainstorm, you know, if those transplants have been sitting in the garden center during this rainstorm outside, boy, I don't know if I'd want to buy them. I would hold off until April to buy. If you haven't bought them yet, I would wait a while. I wouldn't buy them yet. And you definitely don't want to plant them like we talked earlier in the presentation. Close to May 1st would be a safe planting date. So if you buy them now, what you want to do then, you want to take them inside every night, bring them out during the day. And what if you forget or you're going somewhere or whatever? You know, you're just going to let the nurseries grow the plants, you know, they know what to do. So maybe buy it when you need it or not too far ahead, not a month ahead.
Yeah, and I just saw a follow-up. So can we place 1 to 2 week old seedlings in direct sunlight?
Okay, if they haven't, yes, but it depends how long. If they haven't ever been in direct sunlight, I don't know where that person had them before that. But if they've never been in direct sunlight before, maybe a few hours. The sunlight it's not real hot out this time of the year yet. So maybe for a couple hours would be okay, but you want to do it maybe for a little longer every day. You don't want to shock them. Like if we had a warm day and it's real sunny out and they've never been exposed to sunlight before, if you take them out and put them out there all day, you may have some problems. They might start wilting or not look so good because they're just not hardened off yet. They're not used to that. So give them a little bit more every day if possible.
So somebody asked, I'm going to switch topics here a little bit, go back to the earlier list. So someone asked if you're going to plant 2 tomatoes in a hole, is it a larger hole?
Well,
so how close together are you planting them?
I plant them about maybe 8 inches apart.
Yeah. And then here's another one. Does the red mulch really help for tomatoes?
No, no, it doesn't matter what color it is.
Okay. Any recommendations on reducing rat damage?
Oh, rats, that's a whole nother topic. Oh, geez. Boy, I don't know if you might have to screen your plants. You know, you might have to use screening around your entire plant or something because I think they come out at night and eat the fruit. Oh, you may have to screen your plant, put something a total screen around it or something.
Yeah, I'll just add that we do have classes on vertebrate pests. So you can go to whole classes on trapping rats and squirrels and all the other critters who will eat your tomatoes as well as you.
On our website too, there might be something already posted on our website.
Yeah, so again, go to MG Santa Clara and How big a container do you usually use to plant your tomatoes?
Okay, it depends on the variety. Look at the plant tag or seed package and see if it's going to be a really, I don't know, some of those large determinants, I don't think they're good for containers. They just get so humongous. You know, those big determinants that get like 8 feet tall or 6 to 8 feet tall. But something that would get like maybe I use a determinant plant when I plant it in a container. And, you know, I like to use, if it's going to get a plant that gets about 4 feet tall or so, I like to use about a 15-gallon container or similar. If it's a smaller plant, like I showed some pictures of that, like Patio Choice variety that only gets 18 inches tall, that you could probably put like in a 3-gallon container.
Okay,
So it
and
depends
again,
on the variety.
because of COVID, the Santa Clara Master Gardeners aren't doing a plant sale this year, so you'll have to look in your local garden center, or you know, there still may be time to seed some tomatoes there, but read the label on the plant to see how big they grow.
Mhm.
Okay, here's an interesting one. What should pH ranges be for growing tomatoes and peppers? So this person has alkaline soil with a pH around 8 or higher.
Mhm.
Any recommendations?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question, because tomatoes are kind of tolerant of pHs, and most of us in Santa Clara County, or a lot of us, have pretty high pHs of soil. So it sounds like my soil, 8 plus. Yeah, it sounds just like my soil. You know, add a lot of compost. You should be able to grow in that soil. In the Central Valley, they have a lot of problems with soils, and they grow tomatoes pretty well. But add a lot of compost. Add compost. You should do okay. Use mulch. Use organic mulch and add some compost. And I think you'll be okay. Don't be so scared. When I first got pH readings on our water where I live in Morgan Hill, our well water and our soil, I freaked out. And I didn't think I'd be able to grow anything, but that was 20 some years ago, and I've been gardening ever since. Now, if you were growing hydrangeas or azaleas or something, you wouldn't be able to. Or
Right,
blueberries, let's see,
right.
Blueberries, all your acidic crops, you'd have problems.
Right. And for those crops, they add soil sulfur or any of those kind of acidifier products that they sell in the garden centers.
Right.
Okay, Agnes has a problem. She says the rain washed off her aphids, but there are clusters of eggs still attached. What would you do with that?
Oh boy, there are eggs. She can see the eggs. I would try to wash them off. I would try another application, try to wash them off if possible. I don't know if I do, if they're not really, really bad. That's the only thing I would do. Try another kind of heavy stream of water and try to wash them off.
And you can always hope that beneficial wasps will come and lay their eggs inside of those and knock them out.
Right.
Carla says she remembers being told to pinch tomatoes back. Now she's wondering, what did they mean and why did they say that?
Oh, they probably meant doing some pruning. Like I showed that slide on pruning. You can prune the tops if they're getting really unruly and large. It doesn't hurt to prune some of the tops of your tomato, and they may have called that pinching. But I think what they might have meant is that slide that I showed with the leaf, with the little sucker growing between the leaf and the stem. Those you can pinch or snap out of there. So that's probably what they meant. Yeah, you can do some pruning on tomatoes. Doesn't hurt at all.
And a couple of people have tomato plants from last year that are still alive. What can they do to get them to produce again? Should they pull them out, plant new plants?
Well, tomato is actually is a perennial. However, I would be scared about virus diseases. If it were my plant, I think I'd pull it out and start fresh with a fresh plant, from the garden center. If you haven't planted your own seeds, I would do that. And then at least, because when you have a tomato plant that long and it went through the winter, I don't know, with the viruses going around, I just wouldn't trust that it might have something that you might not notice until during fruiting season. And then maybe you won't get such a good yield, or maybe a stunted plant or whatever. I just don't like the idea of holding tomatoes or peppers that long because they're so susceptible to viruses.
Yeah, a lot of us rotate our tomatoes between different beds in the garden for that reason. So Dale was asking, the photo of the indeterminate tomato plants were full of leaves. Were there also a Did you get a lot of tomatoes off of those?
The person who grew those, not that many. No. I mean,
So,
compared
yeah,
to
and
some of the determinants that I've seen with huge harvests, no, some of them are really old varieties and, you know, they just might not be producing much. Sometimes just because they're all or you see that many leaves, that doesn't mean, you know, they didn't produce fruit yet. You know, it was earlier in the season, so. But
well,
they didn't get a huge harvest out of it.
and along the same lines, Arena was asking if with lots of nitrogen, will that just encourage more leaves and not fruits?
Oh, yeah, it will encourage too much nitrogen. You need some. You don't want a nitrogen-starved plant either. You're not going to have a good plant because, again, they use more nitrogen than anything else. But if you add too much nitrogen, yes, you'll get all leaves and no fruit. You're going to get a thicket.
I'm just going to say yes to steer manure and chicken manure. Kathleen is saying she uses a soft bristle brush to remove aphids.
Whatever works.
Oh gosh, the questions just kind of keep coming in. Someone says, I got very small yields last year, less than 10 tomatoes per plant. Can you give some pointers on what to look for?
Well, okay, the soil, you know, did you add compost? Were the conditions good? The light, the water, was it even moisture? You should have even moisture, not too dry, not too wet. Did you maybe have a disease? Because some of those virus diseases can cause stunting. So that could be another possibility. Or even a root disease or something like that. So if you got such a small yield, yeah, there's definitely something going on. And sometimes some varieties are maybe better than others for production.
And you know, I was just talking to some friends about low yields on tomato plants last summer, and we were speculating, at least in my neighborhood, we had those terrible heat spikes, and then it would get really cool. It wasn't consistently hot, it was just in a spike, and we were wondering if that had something to do with it.
Well, that could affect flower production. Yeah. And flowers, of course, eventually turn into tomatoes.
And maybe one last question. Ronnie is asking, could you elaborate on what you mean by low rate of fertilizer?
Oh, okay. A low rate would be the amount you use is low. Okay, on the directions, it depends on the fertilizer. They might say 3 to 5 pounds per 1,000 square feet. Okay, so anything more than 5 pounds is really, really high. 5 pounds would be the high rate on the label. 3 pounds would be the lower rate. Most fertilizers have ranges of rates. If it's a soluble, it might say 1 teaspoon to a tablespoon per gallon of water. So a tablespoon would be the higher of the rate. A teaspoon would be lower rate. So it's really how much you use. The rate is how much you use.
Great. And then I just want to, I think we better call it off. We could go on about tomatoes and peppers all evening. A lot of us spend a lot of time growing them. So much fun. Thank you, Joan, for a terrific presentation. I want to thank the Palo Alto Library for co-sponsoring the event. And thank you to all of you for attending and for your questions and for your enthusiasm about tomatoes and peppers. For additional information, please check the Santa Clara County Master Gardener website. If you have specific questions about something that's growing in your garden, please feel free to contact our Santa Clara County Master Gardener Help Desk or participate in our monthly online plant clinics. And with that, we'll say take care, good night, and happy gardening. Bye, everybody.